The kitchens of the Malvorn Imperial Palace were a living hell of steam, shouting, and perpetual terror. Deep in the belly of the Blackstone Fortress, where the cold magic of the Alpha nobles could not reach, fires roared day and night in massive hearths that could roast entire boars. The air was thick with the smell of burning fat, stale bread, and the acrid sweat of dozens of slaves who moved in practiced, broken silence. Among them, Kira worked the main hearth, her hands raw and blistered from scrubbing iron pots that had been caked with grease for decades. Her gray woolen tunic was stained with soot and gravy, and her feet, wrapped in rags because no one had given her shoes, were perpetually damp and cold. She was 19 years old, though she had long ago stopped counting the years. Time in the kitchens was measured only by the shifting of meal shifts and the rhythm of the Alpha nobles' feasts above. Around her neck sat the heaviest collar in the entire slave quarter. It was not the simple iron band worn by the betas who served the lower halls. Hers was a thick, dark metal inlaid with pulsing silver runes, a suppression collar designed not merely to restrain, but to erase. Every moment of every day, it fed a low, nauseating hum into her veins, dampening something that Kira could no longer remember having. Her scent, that primal marker of Omega biology, had been nullified so completely that even the kitchen dogs sniffed at her with confusion. Her heats, which should have come like the tide, had been stopped entirely 7 years ago. And with them, the fire. Kira touched the collar without thinking, her fingers tracing the cold metal that had fused to her skin years ago. It burned, a constant, dull ache that she had learned to ignore, like the hunger in her belly or the exhaustion in her bones. She had been 12 when they brought her to the processing center. She remembered the beta technomancer with his cold, clinical eyes, the way he had pressed the glowing iron against her throat while she screamed. She remembered the snap of something inside her, a breaking, a silencing, an extinction. And then nothing. No heat. No scent. No memory of who she had been before. "You are a defective beta," the technomancer had said, watching her crumple. "If you were truly an Omega, you would be bred, not scrubbing floors. Be grateful we are giving you purpose." Kira had believed him. For 7 years, she had believed she was nothing, a broken creature, a waste of skin, a girl whose only value lay in how fast she could scrub a pot or how quietly she could endure a beating. When the Alpha Lords passed through the kitchens, she averted her eyes. When the head cook, Greta, struck her with a ladle for being too slow, she accepted it without flinching. When the other slaves whispered about the old bloodlines, the fire Omegas who had once ruled this continent with passion and flame, Kira listened with a hollow sort of envy. She could not imagine having that kind of power. She could not imagine being anything but what she was, a kitchen rat, a ghost, a nothing. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the collar's hum faded into the background and her exhausted body finally gave in to sleep, Kira dreamed. She dreamed of a woman with blazing hands, a woman who screamed her name, Kira, run, as soldiers in silver armor dragged her away. She dreamed of a city of glass and gold, where fire danced in the streets like living things, and people bowed to a queen whose crown was made of living flame. She dreamed of heat, a warmth so vast and consuming that it felt like the sun had taken root in her chest. And then she would wake, and the collar would pulse, and the warmth would vanish, and Kira would remember that she was nothing. On the night of the Emperor's victory feast, the kitchens were in chaos. The Malvorn Empire had just crushed the Southern Rebellion, a desperate uprising of betas and enslaved Omegas who had tried to reclaim the old territories. The Emperor, Cassian Malvorn, had ordered a celebration that would last 3 days, and the kitchens had been working without rest for 48 hours. Kira had not slept. She had not eaten. She had not stopped moving. The other slaves moved around her like ghosts, their faces gray with exhaustion. A young beta boy collapsed near the roasting spit, and Greta kicked him awake with a snarl. No one helped him. No one could afford to. The slightest sign of weakness was punished with a week in the ice cells, where the cold magic of the alphas would seep into your bones and leave you shivering for months. Kira carried a tray of roasted fowl toward the serving corridor, her arms shaking from the weight. The tray was heavy, 12 birds glazed in honey and spices, their skins crisp and golden. She had watched them turn on the spit for hours, her stomach cramping with hunger, but she had not dared to steal even a scrap. The caller would know. The caller always knew. She passed the wine cellar, where 2 beta servants huddled together, whispering. Their voices were low, urgent, filled with a fear that went beyond the usual terror of the kitchens. "Did you hear?" one of them said, a gaunt woman with hollow cheeks. "The general led the attack herself. They say she didn't leave a single survivor. Whole villages burned to ash. They say the emperor is erasing the old bloodlines completely," the other whispered, a man with a nervous twitch. "No fire Omegas left to challenge him. He's been hunting them for decades. If any survived the fall of Emberfall, they're dead now." Kira stopped. The tray wobbled. Something in her chest twisted, a sharp, hot pulse that she had not felt in 7 years. It was like a muscle cramp, deep and visceral, and for a moment, she could not breathe. Emberfall. The name echoed in her mind like a half-remembered song. She had heard it in the slaves' quarters, whispered like a curse, like a prayer. The fallen city of the Fire Omegas, destroyed a decade ago by the first Alpha Emperor. The place where her people, had been burned from history. She shook her head violently, forcing herself to move. She was not one of them. She was a beta, a defective beta, and nothing. The fire was gone. It had never been there. She carried the tray into the Great Hall. The Great Hall of the Malvorn Empire was a monument to cold power. Its vaulted ceilings were supported by pillars of frozen crystal, harvested from the northern glaciers and enchanted to never melt. The walls were lined with ice sculptures, frozen depictions of ancient Alpha victories, their edges sharp enough to draw blood. Blue fire flickered in braziers along the walls, but it gave no warmth. It was a magic of display, of intimidation, of the endless, crushing dominance of the Alpha houses. Tonight, the hall was packed with nobles. They sat at long tables draped in silver cloth, their uniforms crisp with frost, their breath misting in the magically chilled air. The emperor himself sat at the head of the hall on a throne of frozen bone. The bones, it was whispered, of the last Fire Omega queen. Cassian Malvorn was a man in his 50s, but he looked ageless, his pale blue eyes as cold and ancient as the glaciers that bore his family's crust. His hair was white, not with age but with magic, and when he smiled, it was like watching ice crack over a frozen lake. Beside him sat General Lyra, the Emperor's greatest weapon. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with a severe, angular beauty that made the other nobles uneasy. Her uniform was a deep, icy blue, decorated with claw marks from the border wars, actual scars from enemies she had killed with her bare hands. She was 32 years old, the youngest general in the Empire's history, and she had never lost a battle. But there was something in her eyes tonight that had nothing to do with victory. She stared at her plate, her jaw tight, her food untouched. "Still brooding, General?" asked Lord Darius, a portly alpha with a flushed face and a reputation for cruelty. He leaned across the table, his breath reeking of wine. "The war is over. The South is ash. We should celebrate." Lyra did not look up. "Ashes do not celebrate, Lord Darius. They remember." Darius's smile faltered. He did not like being reminded of the cost. He turned away, his gaze sweeping the hall for more agreeable company. His eyes landed on the serving slaves, who moved like shadows among the tables, carrying trays of roasted meats, pitchers of chilled wine, and bowls of sugared fruits. His eyes landed on Kira. She was delivering a tray of roasted fowl to his table, her arms trembling, her face pale with exhaustion. She moved with the careful, head-down shuffle of a slave who had learned that eye contact was a death sentence. But Darius saw something else. He saw a young woman, barely out of girlhood, with dark hair and haunted eyes and a fragility that made his blood stir. "Finally," he said, reaching for the tray. "I thought I'd starve." His hand brushed Kira's wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, something inside Kira shattered. It was not a gradual awakening. It was not a gentle stirring. It was a detonation, an explosion of heat that erupted from the deepest, most buried part of her soul. The collar around her neck glowed white-hot, and for the first time in 7 years, Kira felt fire. Lord Darius's hand burst into flames. He screamed a high, piercing shriek that cut through the music and the laughter. His palm was seared black, the skin blistering and peeling as the fire consumed it. He released Kira, stumbling backward, his face twisted in agony and disbelief. The slave. She attacked me. She used fire. Kira stumbled backward, her own hands smoking. She stared at her palms, where tiny flames danced between her fingers, warm, alive, terrifying. The collar around her neck was melting. Droplets of black iron dripped onto the marble floor, hissing and smoking as they struck the cold stone. The entire hall went silent. Every noble, every guard, every servant froze in place. Even the Emperor's cold smile vanished, replaced by something Kira had never seen on his face: fear. "A fire Omega," someone whispered. "The collar is breaking." She's one of them." Kira looked up, her eyes wild, her body trembling with a heat that was rapidly spreading through her veins. She saw the guards reaching for their swords. She saw the nobles scrambling away from her as if she were a plague. She saw Emperor Cassian rising from his throne, his hands already crackling with ice magic, his face a mask of cold fury. And she ran. She crashed through the servant's door, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone, the remnants of her collar still smoking around her throat. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she could not stay. She had heard the stories, what the Malvorn Empire did to Omegas. The breeding pens where they were used until their bodies gave out. The experiments where technomancers tried to extract their fire for military use. The executions where they were burned at the stake to send a message to anyone who dared to hope. She ran through corridors, past storage rooms and wine cellars, her lungs burning, her heart pounding. The heat inside her was growing, building, demanding release. Tiny sparks flew from her fingertips, singeing the tapestries as she passed. She heard shouting behind her, guards, dogs, the unmistakable roar of an alpha's battle cry. She burst through a side exit and into the palace gardens. The gardens were a frozen maze of ice sculptures and dead hedges, designed to showcase the Emperor's power over nature. Everything was still, cold, and silent. Kira collapsed behind a statue of Cassian himself, a towering ice carving that seemed to mock her with its cold, perfect smile. She curled into a ball, trying to make herself small. Her hands were still smoking. Her body was shaking. The heat in her chest was unbearable, like a second heart that was about to burst. "I am nothing," she told herself. "I am nothing. I am nothing." But the fire inside her whispered, "You are not nothing. You are the last." The footsteps came not as a charge but as a measured, deliberate approach. Kira tensed, expecting a blade. But the figure that emerged from the shadows was not a guard. It was a woman, tall, broad-shouldered, her icy blue uniform unmistakable even in the moonlight. General Lyra. Kira had seen her from a distance many times, always at the Emperor's side, always cold and unapproachable. She was the butcher of the South, the conqueror of a dozen rebellious provinces. She had killed more people than Kira could count. She was the enemy. And yet, she did not raise her sword. She knelt instead, lowering herself to Kira's level with a grace that seemed impossible for someone of her size. Her eyes, gray like winter storms, scanned Kira's face, then settled on the melted collar around her throat. The iron was still smoking, the skin beneath red and blistered. "You," Lyra said softly. Kira flinched, expecting the blow. But Lyra reached out, her fingers cold against Kira's chin, tilting her face toward the moonlight. The touch was impossibly gentle, and Kira's breath caught. "I have seen these burns before," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the walls of Emberfall. On the bodies of the dead. In the eyes of the children who watched their mothers die." Kira stared at her, too terrified to speak. "They were right," Lyra continued. "One survived." She released Kira's chin and sat back on her heels, her expression unreadable. There was a grief in her face that Kira recognized, a grief she had seen in the eyes of the other slaves, the ones who had lost everything. It was the grief of a person who had done terrible things and could not undo them. "Please," Kira managed, her voice cracking. "Please don't kill me." Lyra's jaw tightened. She looked away, toward the palace, where the shouting was growing louder. The guards were combing the gardens, their torches flickering in the darkness. "I have killed enough fire Omegas for one lifetime," Lyra said bitterly. "I have burned enough villages, slaughtered enough innocents. I have done everything Cassian asked, and I have told myself it was duty, that it was necessary, that the Empire could not survive without its iron fist." She laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "It was never duty. It was cowardice." Kira did not understand. She could only stare at the general, this woman who had ended so many lives, who now knelt in the dirt before a kitchen slave. "You have to run," Lyra said, meeting her eyes again. "They are coming." "If they catch you, I know what they do," Kira said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I have heard the stories." Lyra nodded. She reached into her coat and pulled out a heavy pouch of coins, pressing it into Kira's hands. "There is a smuggler in the lower city, a beta named Riven. Tell them I sent you. They will get you across the border." Kira scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking, her hands still smoking. "Why are you helping me?" Lyra stood, brushing the frost from her knees. Her gray eyes met Kira's, and for a moment, the mask of the general cracked, revealing something raw and human beneath. "Because someone should have helped them," she said quietly. "The fire Omegas of Emberfall. The children, the elders, the mothers who fought to the end. They begged for mercy, and I gave them fire instead." She swallowed hard. "I cannot undo what I have done. But I can give you a chance. One chance." Kira stared at her, torn between terror and gratitude. She did not trust Lyra, how could she? But the coins were heavy in her hands, and the alternative was a slow death in the Emperor's dungeons. "Why do you serve him?" Kira asked suddenly, the question spilling out before she could stop herself. "If you know what he is, why do you stay?" Lyra's expression flickered, pain, anger, shame. "Because I was born into this," she said. "Because he raised me. Because I was taught that the Empire is all that matters, and that mercy is weakness." She paused, her voice dropping. "And because I was a coward. I am still a coward. But tonight, I am a coward who is doing one right thing." She stepped back, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "Go," she said. "Do not look back. And do not trust anyone but Riven." Kira hesitated for one breath, too. Then she turned and ran, her bare feet pounding against the frost-hardened ground, the pouch of coins clutched against her chest. Behind her, she heard Lyra's voice, raised in a commanding shout. "The fugitive is heading toward the eastern gate. Send the hounds. I will pursue her myself." The lie was so convincing that even Kira almost believed it. She did not look back. She ran through the gardens, over the frozen hedges, past the statues of dead alphas, toward the lower city and the faint hope of freedom. The lower city was a labyrinth of poverty and desperation. It sprawled beneath the imperial palace like a festering wound, its narrow alleys choked with refuse and despair. The buildings here were cheap timber and crumbling stone, leaning against one another as if the weight of their inhabitants' misery was the only thing keeping them upright. Kira limped through the streets, her body screaming with exhaustion. The remnants of her collar still dangled around her neck, a constant reminder of what she had been and what she now was. Her hands were still smoking, the tiny flames flickering in and out of existence, refusing to be suppressed. She tried to hide them in the folds of her tunic, but the sparks burned through the fabric, leaving black scorch marks. The streets were not empty. Even at this hour, the lower city was alive with the desperate commerce of the poor, candle sellers, beggars, touts offering services that were never named. Betas moved in the shadows, their eyes downcast, their collars glowing with the faint pulse of suppression magic. Here and there, Kira saw Omegas, real Omegas, their scent markers visible even to her dulled senses, huddled in doorways, their bodies thin and their eyes empty. She had always been told she was a defective beta, but now she knew the truth. She was one of them. She was worse than one of them. She was the last, the final ember of a bloodline that had been hunted to extinction. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her like a physical blow. She stumbled into an alley, her back scraping against the rough stone, and she slid to the ground. Her legs would not carry her any further. Her lungs burned. Her hands shook. She thought about giving up. She thought about letting them find her. At least then the running would stop. At least then she could rest. But then she remembered Lyra's face, the grief in her eyes, the words she had spoken. Someone should have helped them. And she remembered her mother's scream, "Kira, run," and the heat of the fire that had burned in her chest before the caller took it away. She forced herself to her feet. She stumbled out of the alley and into a wider street where a faded sign hung over a tavern door. The sign depicted a crimson bird, its wings spread in flight. The crimson canary, the letters red, the paint peeling and faded. Kira pushed open the door. The tavern was seedy and loud, filled with the kind of betas who had given up on hope and settled for survival. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it was small and pathetic, throwing more shadow than light. The air was thick with pipe smoke and cheap ale. Behind the bar stood Riven. They were not what Kira expected. Riven was small and wiry, with quick, clever eyes and a smile that was all teeth, the smile of a predator who had learned to survive in a world of bigger predators. Their dark hair was cropped short, and their clothes were practical, patched, and stained with what looked like old blood. "We're closed," Riven said flatly, not looking up from the glass they were polishing. "Get out." Kira stumbled forward, dropping the pouch of coins on the counter. The impact sent the coins spilling across the wood, a cascade of silver and gold that made Riven's eyebrows shoot up. "Lyra sent me," Kira gasped. She said you would help me. She said you could get me across the border." Riven froze. Their clever eyes scanned Kira from head to toe, taking in the melted color, the smoking hands, the terror in her face. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then they let out a low whistle. "Well, shit," they said. "You're the one they're hunting, aren't you? The fire Omega." Kira's hands flared with heat, the flames leaping higher despite her efforts to suppress them. She tried to hide them behind her back, but it was too late. Riven had seen. "Don't," she started, but Riven was already moving. They grabbed her arm, their grip surprisingly strong, and shoved her behind the bar. There was a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug, and Riven yanked it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase. "Get in," they said. "Now." Kira hesitated. Do you want to live?" Riven interrupted, their voice sharp. "Because if you do, you'll get in the damn hole and stay quiet. I'll handle the guards." Kira obeyed. She scrambled down the stairs, her bare feet finding the cold stone floor of a cellar. Above her, Riven slammed the trapdoor shut, plunging her into darkness. She heard muffled voices above, Riven speaking in a calm, friendly tone and the gruff, demanding voices of Imperial guards. She heard coins clinking, followed by the sound of heavy boots leaving the tavern. Then silence. Kira sat in the darkness, her hands still smoking, her heart still pounding. The heat in her chest was unbearable now, a pressure that demanded release. She curled into a ball, pressing her hands against her stomach, trying to push the fire back down. But the fire would not be pushed. For the first time in 7 years, Kira felt her heat approaching. Not the suppressed, dulled phantom of a heat that the collar had allowed, a real, full, burning heat that rose from her core like a volcano preparing to erupt. She had been told all her life that Omega heats were weaknesses, that they made women fragile, emotional, incapable of leadership. But this was not weakness. This was power. This was rage. This was everything she had been denied for 7 years. She looked at her glowing hands and understood, at last, the truth that the Malvorn Empire had tried to bury. The fire was not a curse. The fire was her birthright. "I will not die on my knees," she whispered into the darkness. "I will rise." Above her, the tavern creaked. The night was far from over. But in the cellar, the last fire Omega had made her first real choice, to survive, to fight, and to become what she was always meant to be. In the war room of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Cassian Malvorn stood before a map of his empire, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard that the wood had begun to freeze. His face was a mask of cold fury, his pale blue eyes glittering with a rage that made his advisors shrink back. "The Fire Omega," he said, his voice soft and terrifying. "Alive. In my palace. For 7 years." He turned slowly, and the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. Frost crept across the floor, climbing the walls like living vines. "I ordered every Fire Omega in the continent hunted down," he continued. "I burned Emberfall to the ground. I killed their queen with my own hands. I made certain that no trace of their bloodline would remain." He slammed his fist against the table. Ice exploded from the point of impact, freezing the map, the scrolls, the inkwells. The rivers on the map became solid white lines. The cities became frozen dots. "And yet," he said, his voice rising, "one survived. One miserable, collared kitchen slave, a girl who was so insignificant that she was allowed to scrub floors under my own roof, is the last of them. And now she has escaped." The advisors exchanged terrified glances. One of them, a thin beta with a nervous twitch, dared to speak. "Majesty, the prophecy. The old texts say that the last Fire Omega will—" "I do not care what the texts say," Cassian roared. "I am the Emperor of the Malvorn Empire. I have conquered continents. I have crushed rebellions. I will not be undone by a prophecy and a kitchen girl." He stalked toward the window, staring out at the lower city, where the lights of the slums flickered like distant stars. "Burn the city," he said flatly. "Every building. Every alley. Every hovel. Leave no one alive. I want her ashes." "But Majesty," another advisor said, "the lower city holds thousands of loyal subjects. Betas, even some alphas, then they will die for the Empire," Cassian said coldly. "That is their purpose." He turned back to the map, his fingers tracing the route toward the southern border. "She will try to cross into the old territories," he mused. "She will think she can find refuge in the ruins of Emberfall. But Emberfall is a tomb. There is nothing there but bones and ash." He smiled, a smile like cracking ice. "Send the hounds. Send the generals. Send every soldier we can spare. I want her brought to me alive. I want to watch the light die in her eyes." In the cellar of the Crimson Canary, Kira knew nothing of the Emperor's fury. She knew only the heat in her chest, the fire in her hands, and the vow she had whispered into the darkness. She was not nothing. She was the last of a bloodline that had once ruled this continent. She was the keeper of a fire that the Empire had tried to extinguish. And she would not rest until every chain was broken, every collar was melted, and every Omega was free. She did not know how she would do it. She did not know if she would survive. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the Malvorn Empire had made a terrible mistake by letting her live. She lifted her hands in the darkness, and the fire blazed brighter than it ever had before. "I will rise," she said again, her voice steady now. "And I will burn them all." Hey, congratulations, you made it till the end. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I would really appreciate you giving a like and subscribe, and stay tuned for next episode in upcoming week.